Back in 2020, a report was released that Connecticut has some of the most restrictive voting laws in the country, making it particularly hard for Black and Latino voters to make it to the polls and use their voice. Many people agreed that Connecticut needed to expand voting, and in 2023 legislative session, our state did just that with early voting. But questions remain about its implementation and its cost. We are joined today by the Secretary of State, Stephanie Thomas, to talk of early voting and more. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast, in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state and local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders. Secretary Thomas, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Good to have you. So it's been almost 100 episodes and 3.5 years on the Municipal Voice since we last had the Secretary of State on the show, which at that time was still Denise Merrill, your predecessor. And that was in a previous election cycle. So we were talking about voting access. It was important then, still important now. Why is voting so important?
Oh my gosh. How much time do you have, Matt?
Here's a little question. Why is voting important?
I mean, it really is the underpinning of our democratic process, our system of government. We have a representative democracy, so we as electors get to vote who will represent us at the table, so to speak. So having access to the vote and making sure that everyone who does have access is using that vote, I think without that, our democracy is floundering.
Yeah. And speaking of making sure everyone's using that right, our members of CCM are municipal leaders of the towns and cities across the state. And this next election is going to be a municipal election. And generally, these elections get a turnout under 35%.
Yeah.
What is the connection between the popularity and quest for greater access and the fact that we have such a low turnout year after year?
I think about low turnout a lot, but I think it is because we as a nation don't really invest in civic literacy. When, I look at what's done at the federal, the state, and the local level, no one is really investing in helping voters carry out this most important civic duty. Sure, there's some education depending on what state you're in and what grade you're in, but in general, I just think it's woefully lacking. And I think voters have gotten a bad rap in some ways, like they don't care. So they're not showing up in municipal election years. And there may be some of that, but I also think they aren't well informed. And what a lot of registrars will tell me is if people aren't sure, that also keeps them from the polls. If they don't feel informed about what's on the ballot, how the system works, or what they might face when they get there, that is another way of preventing full turnout, if you will. I also believe we have highest turnout in presidential years because, face it or not, whether we want to face it or not, we are a very sort of television-based culture. And the airwaves are flooded for sometimes as long as a year with ads reminding people that an election is coming. And even when there's a gubernatorial election, for example, you saw that last year here in Connecticut. But for municipal elections, no one can afford to go up on television. So I talk to people all the time who have no idea that there's a primary coming up in September. And, they know there's an election, but they don't really have it starred on their calendar. So I think we as government can do a lot more to help imbue voters with the confidence to know when elections are and what they can expect.
So that as a government, you can do that stuff. And then is there some stuff more specifically that your office can do to help drive those numbers up?
Sure. Our office is trying to partner with as many organizations as possible who are as interested as we are in providing nonpartisan information to help voters understand how to engage with our democracy. One program that we started, we call it our CEO program, and it stands for Civically Engaged Organizations. I'm a business owner. As you know, we also deal with business services here. And it occurred to me that all the businesses I know involved with their community, whether it's donating to Little League or doing an Earth Day cleanup. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if they also got involved with civics, letting their customers or clients or employees know when an election is coming up, how to register to vote, how to find your polling place. And I have had at least one municipality reach out to me about joining the program as well. And I think that would be a great way to partner with CCM's members, because I feel if you keep it top of mind, it's more likely to happen. So our office puts together nonpartisan tools like simple social media slides, fact sheets. Like right now, the big thing we're working on is a college 101 because college students don't know what to do. So it would be great if municipalities joined our CEO program and help us get the word out.
Very cool. Well, some of them might be listening right now, so maybe they will. I think it's important. You mentioned that it's nonpartisan, and that's good to remember. Is that it's not about which side of the issue on that everybody should vote. It's good for everybody. You're not just trying to encourage one side or the other.
100%.
Everybody vote your conscience. So you spoke at this year's Representation Matters, which is a CCM program where we do a 2-day training with the campaign school at Yale that was aimed to help people of color seek office, serve boards and commissions. And you spoke about your path to elected office and how unlikely it seemed, at every turn. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I always tell people, don't do it the way I did it. But the way we did it, on paper, it shouldn't have worked. But it was very organic. And what I do say is that people should follow their passions. I had a long career in the nonprofit sector. I was very happy doing that work. I was running my own fundraising consulting firm and doing quite well. And it wasn't until I started meeting some people locally, going to meetings and finding out how things worked. And I think I never considered myself someone who would run for office or get involved in what I called politics, although now I would say it's getting involved in governance. I thought I was doing the public good in the nonprofit space, but I saw a need. I saw that there weren't a lot of people who were like me. And some people think I mean as a woman or as a woman of color, and I do mean those things, but I also mean as a nonprofit professional. I would sit at a table and hear people discuss a problem, and I would say like, hey, the nonprofits solved this problem 10 years ago. You didn't know that this was the best way to handle it, and people didn't know sometimes. So I ran for office. I petitioned my way onto the ballot because I had passed the convention dates, and I ran what I like to describe as a very organic, last minute campaign. I really got started very late summer, and I lost that election, but only by a few hundred votes, which I considered a win. And then I decided to run again for different reasons. And I won. And then I decided to run for secretary because it was a job that really appealed to me. It was not the sort of, I don't know, luster of serving at the constitutional level. But two of my passions are civic engagement, civic education, and making sure people vote in every single election. But I also love business because I'm a small business owner, and I worked for a small business for 20 years prior to that, opening my own. So I felt like the secretary's office involved both things that I love. So I
Yeah.
applied for the job and here I am.
And here you are. So it sounds like, in your previous nonprofit work and then in what you're doing now, that, as you mentioned, civic engagement is a large part of that. What is your vision for civic engagement?
Oh, you know, I think at its core, my vision is to encourage people to think differently. I would love to get to a point where there was federal and state investment in civic education and civic engagement.
Hmm.
Um, when I speak with groups, I often talk about, especially high schoolers, for example, I say to them, like, do you play a sport? And almost
Hmm.
all of them raise their hand. And I say, what if you played that sport one day a year? How good would you be? And they're like, oh, we would
Yeah.
suck. And I think the same is true with our representative democracy. You can't just vote and like poof, like magic, everything suddenly works out. If you don't add the engagement piece, we're
Hmm.
only sort of half living. So even people who vote don't think that they need to communicate to their representatives. I'm sure every town manager would love to know what their constituents think
Hmm.
and have issues brought up to them so that because they can't be everywhere. And the
Yeah.
same is true with elected officials. So my vision is to teach people what I like to call civics you can use,
Hmm.
how to engage with your community. One example, I was speaking with a group and a 22-year-old woman. I said, like, who has had a problem in their town or their community that they wanted solved?
Hmm.
She complained about a huge pothole that was at the end of her parents' driveway and it drove her family
Hmm.
crazy. So I said, oh, well, what'd you do about it? And she was like, oh, we don't do anything. I said, well, did you call the city and let them know the pothole was there? And she's like, oh, no, I didn't know you could do that. And like, that's a low hanging example, but people just, I think, have gotten used to complaining and thinking that government is not there for them. And I
Hmm.
think people who govern are like, I wish people would give me some input and let me know what some of the problems are.
Yeah.
So my vision is that it's more of a two-way street and it's
Yeah.
more community based.
Is that something that's more recent? Like, were in the past, were people more civically engaged? Were there civics classes, and is that something that we should kind of bring back, like in high school or something, like
Yeah,
civics, history, English, just another subject?
yeah, I would love to see civics integrated into education. It did used to be taught. Anyone my age also remembers there was public broadcasting money to do things like Schoolhouse Rock.
Hmm.
Um, but when I talk to seniors, they often talk about how, and I'm thinking, people 70 and over, like,
Hmm.
I've never missed an election. I vote every time. And how come the young people don't feel the
Yeah.
same way? But they had civics in school, and many of them also
Yeah.
lived through wartime,
Hmm.
where there was much more of a national identity. And I think that has stayed with them.
Yeah.
There was one piece of legislation I introduced this year that never made it through the process, but that is pre-registration
Hmm.
of 16-year-olds, because that's a time when many are interacting with the DMV,
Hmm.
so that when they're 18, they're already in the system and can be confirmed and activated.
Yeah.
Because it shows if you have these civic lessons and think about it earlier in life, you're more likely to be a voter throughout the rest of your life.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM. Kind of interesting. We always hear people talk about, the kids these days. There's quotes going back to Greek times about that sort of stuff. But do the numbers actually show that the younger generations aren't voting necessarily even at the same rate that the 70 that generation were voting when they were younger? Like, has the voting trends followed that generation through, or are the young people now likely to start voting more as they get to be that age?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Obviously, I'm not an expert
Yeah.
of every state, and there are differences between
Hmm.
elections for some of the reasons we already talked about, presidential elections
Yeah.
versus special elections, primary elections, etc. But I do think that what I hear from a lot of young people is just a lack of understanding
Hmm.
because they aren't taught a lot of this. One of the things I hear the most is confusion about, if they're away at college, for example,
Hmm.
do they vote where they're in college? Do they vote in their hometown? Which is why we're working on a College 101
Okay. Very cool.
little fact sheet. And I thought there was a very interesting thing. I've been doing a lot of sort of anecdotal conversations with our interns and young
Hmm.
people wherever I meet them. And I say, like, there's a lot riding on you. We put a lot of, we always hear the young people will save us. They will
Yeah.
do X, Y, and Z. And I ask them if they're voting and why or why not, or what
Yeah.
they think about it. And one thing really stuck with me, so I try to think about it in our work here. One said, our generation is dealing with many of us, many of them have high levels of anxiety,
Hmm.
whether it was brought on by COVID or just social media. Like, we can debate the causes,
Hmm.
but it's just the fact that there were like a lot of my peers feel anxious about things. So voting feels very complicated.
Hmm.
And we, the adults, need to make it feel easier to
Hmm.
understand how to engage.
Yeah.
So I really took that to heart because you should see us over here. Whenever we try to put together a social media post, we're like, oh, well, if it's this kind of election, you do this kind of thing. And if you're
Hmm.
in this town, you do that. And there's all these exceptions, and it can be quite complicated. So we've taken it to heart to try to explain things in plain English and as simplified as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose we were in a time frame where young people used to be able to buy pretty much anything over their phone at any time. The idea of having to like go to some municipal
Yeah.
building and talk to someone at a desk and have them check your ID, like the whole thing seems
Well, you'd be
strange. Yeah.
surprised how many young people have no idea how to address an envelope and put a stamp on it.
Yeah. So, but does I guess the question, does we have to teach them how to do the old way, or does the way we do things need to catch up to the way people are doing things now?
Probably a little
A
of
little
both,
little
right?
bit of
And at
both, little
some
column
point,
A,
they'll
little
meet
column
in the
B.
middle.
Yeah. So Connecticut did in fact pass elections related bills this year. Could you tell us a little bit about the early voting package that passed and what people can expect from it?
Sure. So a package did pass. I won't get into all the details
Mhm.
unless you want me to. But in general, it'll start in 2024 with
Hmm.
the presidential preference primary in April. And then it will be adopted, obviously, for the August primary and going on to the
Hmm.
presidential election in November. It's a 4-day period for special elections and
Okay.
presidential preference primaries,
Okay.
7 days for regular primaries, and 14 days for general elections. So
Okay.
that's what people can expect. Um, and right now, we are at the Secretary's office writing a handbook, if you will,
Okay.
for registrars, with all of the details of the bill and how towns can apply for additional locations. The
Hmm.
bill only calls for one location per town, but towns can add additional
Okay.
locations if their population is 20,000 or higher. Um,
Hmm.
and they'll have to present their plan to us with regard to ballot security, chain of custody, and a lot of those details. But
Hmm.
we are writing a template, if you will, that towns can use as a
Okay.
foundation.
So, and then obviously before the election, you're going to distribute that out to them. I'm sure we'll see
Yes.
it and share it with everybody that we can, just so everyone
Yes,
knows what's going on.
absolutely. And our office, it was really important to me once I was inaugurated to make sure I did it during my campaign, but I wanted to stay in regular contact with registrars and town
Hmm.
clerks just to make sure that one, it's always good as a leader to listen to the people closest
Yep.
to the work, right? Because they know things I couldn't possibly know. So
Yeah.
I started having a monthly call with both groups separately. And we cover a lot of ground, but it
Hmm.
really, what that meant was when it came time for me to speak with legislators and start to write this handbook, etc., I had voices, small towns, medium
Yeah.
towns, large towns. I had all of that already at my disposal. And once we write the handbook, we will have a working group of registrars look at it.
Hmm.
And then I'm going to send it to all the registrars and
Yeah.
town clerks to look at, because the more input we get, the better it will be for towns of all
Yeah.
sizes. Yeah.
Important to get the input from the boots on the ground, as it were, just because,
Yeah.
the most well-intentioned laws sometimes can be written in
Yes.
a way where it ends up making complications for the people who actually have to do it. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so implementation of early voting will have a lot of moving pieces, but I'm sure there's a lot to learn from the 46 other states who have already done it. What are the top three things that our cities and towns can do to prepare for it?
Good question. I definitely, what most people don't know, right now, there's no money allocated in the budget for
Hmm.
public education. So I do see that as a problem. Our office will certainly make a play, or an ask for
Hmm.
a mid-year adjustment, in the biennium. But I think towns can really help them by educating their population,
Hmm.
whether it's flyers up around towns, information on the website, holding a town hall, etc. I
Hmm.
think that will help. That's one thing. Um, I think towns can also be very instrumental in reaching out to communities that might have problems accessing this information that is
Hmm.
just out there in the public domain, whether it's going to senior centers in town, putting flyers in other languages in child's backpacks when they go
Hmm.
home from school, whatever it is to get the word out in the community. And third, and I think this is really important, I think town leaders should be sitting down now with their registrars and
Hmm.
their state delegation
Hmm.
to really talk through what early voting would look like in the town and think about what some of the pain points might be, if any.
Hmm.
And I would encourage towns to do this and be specific and
Hmm.
realistic. Sometimes people are like, anything can happen. Like, we might get 5,000 people come at one
Yeah.
moment. And I'm like, that's probably not going to happen if you're in union,
Yeah.
So I think if people can have those specific, realistic conversations and
Hmm.
have it with their delegation, then that would be really, really helpful to prepare both the town leaders, but also the delegation with
Hmm.
how they will answer when I request that budgetary adjustment.
Yeah, and speaking of the budgetary adjustment there, you said there wasn't money included really for the education of this. Was there any money included for staffing or anything? Because I know at CCM we're always
um,
concerned that, something passes and there's no money for it, that it's what we call an unfunded mandate.
Yeah, it's definitely an underfunded mandate
Okay.
at this point, I would say. So for the first year of the biennium, each town will receive $10,000,
Okay.
$10,500 to help offset the costs.
Hmm.
And that may help some towns. It won't
Hmm.
be enough to help others because every
Hmm.
town is getting the same amount.
So even you said there's some that the bigger cities might need to have or three locations. They would still only get the
Exactly. Or
10,000
more
at this point.
importantly,
Hmm.
many more workers.
Mm.
Because, a Saturday in Waterbury is going to be different than a Saturday in Canterbury. Um,
Mm.
so they will have some money. The only election in this first year of the biennium is the
Mhm.
presidential preference primary. So that
Mhm.
is typically not very high turnout. It's a
Mhm.
4-day period. So I think it's workable. What
Mhm.
is more concerning is the lack of funding for the second year in the
Mhm.
biennium, which includes the presidential election,
Okay.
which is typically, there are some towns in Connecticut that have 90% turnout.
Mhm.
And with early voting happening for the first time, I think towns will certainly need some help defraying
Yeah.
costs. In part because I think registrars will do their due diligence to make sure they are not caught short. The
Mhm.
last thing you want is Waterbury assigns 2 people to work on a Saturday at noon.
Mhm.
Like we can imagine what the lines might look like now.
Yeah.
Uh, so I encourage when the towns sit down and have these conversations, if they know there are problems that they will experience, they should definitely be reaching
Mhm.
out again to their legislators, to the governor's office, etc., to just explain what those
Yeah.
issues are as clearly as possible.
Yeah, and it sounds like maybe that first one with the lower turnout could in some ways be helpful to test out, the early voting, a test run, as it were, before the big one to root out some of
Absolutely.
the problems that you might have, especially when it then scales up for the
Exactly. The good
fallout.
news
Yeah.
is we do have the presidential primary, but we also have the August primary
Hmm.
to as a bit of a dry run before the main election.
We kind of so find some of those problems before go to the big time there. Um, Now, I know in the past that your office has helped provide training for new staffers for this kind of stuff. Is this something that you're going to be doing for this coming election?
Yes, the good news is there was money in the budget for our office to help every municipality with poll workers. So the money in our budget is for us to put together a uniform training program,
Hmm.
which will be a huge help to the towns, who usually, like every town, just does it their
So
own
currently there
way.
isn't like one
No,
unified plan for how to
no.
do it. Okay.
Exactly. Although all the towns often get together and share
Hmm.
best practices, but we will be helpful. We also will be taking on a role to help with poll worker recruitment. So we
Okay.
are looking to partner with organizations like Vet the Vote, the colleges and universities, even the Connecticut Bar Association, and other people who may be able to step up and serve. And I
Hmm.
think municipalities can help as well. For example, we've been going town to town doing poll worker appreciation events
Oh,
because
cool.
it's been really, really cool. And I can't tell you how people seem to love it. And there are many poll workers who have been doing this. We award people over 10 years, over 20
Hmm.
years. I met someone a few weeks ago who had been doing it 49 years,
Wow.
and that's amazing. So just elevating that type of community involvement, because usually what happens, registrars just ask around, poll
Hmm.
workers ask friends and family. So sometimes you see like husband, wife, and their children all serving. So I think if towns could put out the call, that would
Hmm.
also be helpful.
Very cool. And will this training all be in person, or will it be opportunity to do some of it online?
It's a little early to know. What we are, or I won't say we, what I am thinking
Hmm.
at this moment, and we just started this process now, vetting costs to see what kind of system we can
Hmm.
afford based on the budget
Yep.
awarded to us. But ideally for me, it would be an online module with, comprehension testing,
Hmm.
like you see in these automated systems, that would be the basis of the training. And then,
Hmm.
like happens now with moderators, for example, they take
Hmm.
a course, but then they have to sit down with their local registrar and sort of get that
Hmm.
hyper local sort of uh, reminders right before the election, and
Hmm.
also some of that special information like Mrs. So-and-so comes in every year and needs, I don't know, curbside voting, or there's all this hyper local information that the local registrars will have. So
Hmm.
I'm hoping an online module followed up with on-site in-person training right before the election.
Very cool. And just one final question. We always like to, be positive at the end of our show. Overall, how do you feel about the future of elections in Connecticut? Do you think we're heading down the right path towards more open and equitable elections?
Oh, let's see, a feel good. I do think we're moving down the right path. As you know, there are many states around the country where voting rights are being taken away, or it's being made more difficult to vote. Here in Connecticut, especially, I work so closely with the registrars. I know that every single person in the election space in Connecticut is really committed to making sure that the franchise is protected, making
Hmm.
sure that we as American citizens can exercise our right to vote and truly participate in this representative democracy. So the more involved I get, the happier I am that, everyone, I think here in Connecticut, we're the land of steady habits. And
Hmm.
sometimes I wish we weren't so steady. But in this, we're also the Constitution state. And I just think we take it very seriously that people
Yeah.
deserve the right to vote. So I'm happy to be in this job at this time to help people have access and maybe kick it up a notch and pick up some civic education as they go.
Well, great. It seems like we have the right person for the job. Secretary Stephanie Thomas, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. And keep working on making everyone get out there and vote.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Have a good day.
We'd like to thank our guest, Secretary of the State Stephanie Thomas. We'd like to thank our sponsors at Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry draws on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.